Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. An interesting topic on the pod today, one that really doesn't get enough media coverage, and an equally interesting guest who truthfully brought it to our attention. Dr. Peter Nicholson is making his second appearance here on the Herle Burly. We're talking about his specific observations on the 2024 World Happiness Report. Peter has written a fantastic online piece on this, and I encourage you to read it by clicking on the quotes page at airquotesmedia.com. The report explores the nature and implications of a particular concept of happiness in a cross-nation context, which has clear implications for public policy thinking. A key finding from the 2024 report we'll dive into today: people in the developing world are generally more optimistic about their future than people in the developed world. Breaking it down further, younger people are happier in the developing world, older people less happy. In the developed world, the opposite is true. If you don't know Peter, he's a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Nova Scotia. He's a true polymath who has served in numerous posts in government, business, science, and higher education. His long public service career included positions as head of policy in the Office of the Prime Minister of Canada and the Clifford Clark Visiting Economist with Finance Canada. Peter is currently the chair of the board of the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices and one of the world's foremost experts in Texas country swing music.
Right.
Peter, welcome back to the Herle Burly.
Thanks, David. Great to be here.
Yeah. Hey, Peter, maybe you could start us off with a brief description of what this project is. It's been undertaken for a number of years. Who does it and why?
Yes. Well, the origins go back to John Halliwell, actually, who was a professor of economics at UBC and is still an emeritus there. And John, I think, was struck by the fact that while we focus most of our political discussion on economics, GDP per capita, things like that, really economics is a means to an end, and the end, of course, is a satisfied population, whatever that should mean. And so Halliwell, being really a superb statistician as well as a first-class economist, decided to really take that insight seriously and see what data could bring to could actually reflect some light on this question of what happiness is, how it's changed over time, what contributes to it. Now, the institutional manifestation of that is a very large document that's been coming out annually for the last 12 years. Covering data actually back to 2006. The data itself is largely based on the Gallup World Poll, which has been taking place for years and years and years. And in particular, a question in that poll, and I can read you precisely what the wording is, quote, evaluate your current life as a whole using the image of a ladder with the best possible life for you as a 10 and the worst possible life a 0. Now, that simple question has been asked for years, the same question, to a very wide sample of countries. In fact, in the most recent report, they covered 143 countries across the world. And both the scale of the polling result by Gallup and the consistency of the question over a long period of time, I think provides a lot of credibility for the results. Now, what Halliwell and his colleagues have done with that data over the years is to produce these more or less 185 to 250 page annual reports, which are rather academic. I'd still urge listeners to at least look at the executive summary, but it is a very rigorous statistical exercise. They report the facts more than they try and delve into the whys behind those facts, and we can talk about some of that today. Obviously, what I should say is that the measure of happiness is the yes/no is the answer to that question on a scale of 1 to 10. How do you evaluate your life as a whole? And the the data is averaged over these 143 countries, and it produces a score on a 10-point scale. Now, the number one country in the latest report, the one that came out just a few months ago, is Finland, and it has been number one for the last 7 years. Its score was 7.74 out of 10. Drawing up at the bottom, which probably comes as no surprise, was poor Afghanistan at about 1.7, and the other 143 are right in between. Canada was number 15 at a score of 6.9, about, well, a little less than a point behind Finland. The U.S. Number 23, I think, at 6.7, a little bit less than Canada, but not a lot. Interestingly, all of the Scandinavian countries, including Iceland, are 5 out of the top 7.
Yeah.
The only one, in fact, that wasn't Scandinavian, or the only two, were Israel at number 6 and the Netherlands or Israel at number 5 and the Netherlands at number 6. So anyway, that's the basic data.
Right. And they have drilled down a little bit into what makes people happy, haven't they?
Yes.
And it's more than just money.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, money clearly is important. But yeah, they've identified 6 factors which have statistical measures according to yes/no answers to questions, as well as some data. The six are the following. The first is GDP per capita, and that's measured. That's not an individual response. Obviously, it applies to the country. The second factor is something called social support, and the question basically is there someone that you can count on if you're in trouble? And again, it's a yes or no. The third factor is healthy life expectancy, not just life expectancy itself, but life expectancy in reasonably good condition. And that's based on measures collected by the World Health Organization. The fourth factor is an interesting one. It says, to what extent do you feel you have freedom and choice in knowing what to do with your life, or deciding what to do with your life? Again, yes or no. The fifth is generosity, and it basically asks people if they've made a donation to charity in the last 6 months or some time like that. And the final one is the degree of corruption in your society, both at the level of business and at the level of government. So those 6 factors are measured, and they are fed through a gigantic statistical analysis called a regression model. And it turns out that in totality, they explain about 3/4 of the national variation in the ultimate happiness ranking. The problem is, of course, that what's causality rather than just correlation, because people who are happier tend to be healthier, and people who are healthier perhaps tend to be happier. And there's no question that there's some correlation between GDP and overall health and then perhaps corruption. So it isn't a totally clean statistical analysis, but there's been a lot of work done on that over the last 12 years. And the econometricians that analyze all this data have concluded that those 6 are probably about as good as you're going to get on a cross-national basis.
So you have been following government and being at the heart of government for a significant period of your life. How do those 6 tests compare to the considerations policymakers generally have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer to that question perhaps explains why this notion of happiness hasn't gained a whole lot of traction. And that would be because policy already deals with the factors that I was just talking about. I mean, if you look at GDP per capita, of course, all of our economic policy levers are trying to improve that. When it comes to social support, our social policy is generally trying to fill in the gaps that our ordinary human relationships and individual circumstances don't. In terms of health, of course, healthcare policy, the socialization of health, the health insurance. All of these things are directly policy attempts to improve healthy life expectancy. On the freedom of choice, I would say that education and institutional anti-discrimination rules, things like that, are direct policy responses to that. In terms of generosity, I mean, we have a tax deduction for charitable donations. In terms of anti-corruption, of course, there are all sorts of legal sanctions, and then there's the issue just of social norms that favor fair play. So one could say that when you look across the policy spectrum, virtually all of the bases are covered. Anyway, we can get into that in more depth.
Do you think there's a chance that we overstate or overestimate the importance of the GDP per capita component of that? When I look at Costa Rica being happier than Canada, there's obviously some things that can offset income.
Yeah, there are. I mean, if you look at the U.S., it pretty much leads the world in GDP per capita, but that's significantly offset in this allocation of cause by healthy life expectancy, which remarkably in the U.S. has decreased for most of the last 10 years, which is shocking. I mean, it's the only highly industrialized country which has seen that trend. So yeah, there's puts and takes. I think what you could say about GDP per capita, although it doesn't measure the quality of life, it correlates with an awful lot of other things. And even though, Costa Rica, of course, is, I see it now, it's ranked about 12th in the overall 143 countries. But within Central America or Latin America generally, Costa Rica actually does have a reasonably good economic performance. And it's got a relatively non-corrupt government and, ranks high on many of the other characteristics. But I don't think it's wrong to basically accept that GDP per capita is perhaps the most important single measure.
Okay. Most of you Herle Burly-ites know I worked for Paul Martin for 25 years. The first thing he talked to me about when I met him, equal opportunity for Indigenous people. It was a focus of his government, and he's continued his efforts long past his prime ministership. June is National Indigenous History Month, a time to honor and recognize the rich cultures, histories, and contributions of Indigenous peoples in Canada, so all Canadians can learn about and appreciate the diverse traditions, languages, and experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Our presenting sponsor TELUS not only believes in that, they act on it. They were the first technology company to formalize a commitment through their Indigenous Reconciliation Action Plan, built in full partnership with Indigenous peoples, guided by their voices, and committed to progressing the path of reconciliation in a deeply meaningful way. Embedded here is this idea that as technology progresses to levels most of us couldn't even contemplate a few years ago, TELUS will advance their commitment to reconciliation with every new step. And so they've just declared they will not use artificial intelligence technology to create or replicate the art or imagery of Indigenous peoples. These are the tenets of their pledge. TELUS is proud to support the artistic practices of Indigenous peoples and fully recognizes the historic role organizations have played in the misappropriation of Indigenous art and culture. And as leaders in the ethical and responsible use of AI, TELUS believes Indigenous data sovereignty is crucial, with Indigenous peoples fully controlling and protecting their cultural heritage and artistic expressions. That's a pretty powerful example of this idea that reconciliation must be ongoing work, Herle Burly-ites. You can learn more about the declaration, view the art, and learn more about how you can appropriately support Indigenous artists at telus.com/responsible AI declaration. It's tempting to go right to the trend lines and find some negatives in this. But the top line takeaway, Peter, is that Canadians are among the happiest people in the world.
Yes.
Now, maybe that shouldn't surprise me, but given the mood of the country, it kind of does.
Well,
I mean, what must the mood be like in other countries?
well, that's certainly the case in the Western democracies. Virtually all of them are at best flat or declining, and these trends are still relatively modest in some sense. Let's look at Canada. I think back in 2006 when Gallup was asking this question, Canada was about 7.5. Now in the most recent, they're down to about 6.9. You could say, well, that's not much, but it's significant. It's a decline of 10%, and moreover, it's been quite steady. There's no question, there's a little bump in the trend, but not much. And similarly, the U.S. Meanwhile, if you look at, I focus quite a bit on China and Russia, simply because they're fairly obvious comparators in this case. And, China's rating since 2006 has been up by about a third. They went from 4.6 back in 2006 to 6.1 in 2023.
So is that the emerging middle class in China that we hear so much about?
It is, and the younger people. There's a gradient there, and we can talk about the age gradient, which is important.
Yeah.
That in a lot of the developing countries, the younger cohort, let's say the under 30s, tend to be the happiest, and the over 60s the least happy.
Yeah. Well, let's just
whereas
park
in
that
the West, it's the opposite.
So, opposite. Let's just park that for a second because I want to get into that in some detail.
Yeah.
The decline you talked about in Canada, the report attributes much of that decline to those who feel to declines in the percentage of Canadians who feel socially connected to other people.
Yes.
And declines among those who feel they have the freedom to make choices in their own lives.
Yes.
COVID?
Yeah, well, yes, although I think, again, if you look at the individual answers to those questions, the negative trend has been in play for a long time. It really goes back 15 years or more. There's no question that COVID produced a downdraft in some sense, although, in terms of social support in Canada, you saw more of a decline in 2023, that through COVID it was fairly flat. And I think people did feel some sense of coming together during that time. But both in Canada and the U.S., there's been quite a precipitous drop in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, but this is a phenomenon that people have been talking about for several decades. I think back to Putnam's Bowling Alone, right? I mean, are we as socially connected as we used to be? What's the role of technology and all that? But, feeling connected to your community and feeling like you've got people who care about you seems pretty fundamental to your happiness.
Yeah, it obviously is, and I think at a personal level, it's much more important than GDP per capita, or even healthy life expectancy. These are kind of abstract statistics. The other one that surprised me, though, was this perception of freedom to make your life choices, and in fact, the decline over the period from 2006 to today was even greater on that variable than it was in social support. And again, both in Canada and the US, but interestingly, in both social support and this perception of choice, the decline in the US was even greater than in Canada. So you ask yourself, in the land of the free, the US, how can it be that their perception of freedom to make a choice as to what to do with your life has not only been declining, but isn't much greater in the U.S. than it is in China and Russia?
Well, and lower than Canada. Let's just take that as a comparison
and lower
point.
than Canada, definitely.
In absolute terms, Canadians feel freer than Americans to make their choices about their lives.
Yes.
So this is fascinating, Peter, because it must mean that freedom means something more than just the right to carry a gun.
Yes.
It must encompass freedom from as well as freedom to.
Yes. And I think the sense in the U.S. that the deck is stacked against you, not everybody, obviously, it's stacked very much in favor of some and against others. So inequality would play into this. Certainly, racial discrimination against many of the visible minorities would obviously play into it. A sense that if you're born with a silver spoon, you're going to die with a silver spoon.
Yep.
Which goes counter, of course, to the Horatio Alger mythology of America,
Yes.
which I think was a valid one at one time in their history.
Requires upward mobility.
It requires upward mobility, and there's other statistical analysis that is established within the OECD group of countries. Americans have among the worst upward mobility in economic terms, which is what's the probability that you can go from the bottom quintile to the top quintile over your lifetime.
Yeah.
No.
This also made me think, Peter, on the GDP per capita side, it made me think about something that you have said occasionally to me in conversation over the years, which is GDP per capita has big impact on happiness, but is the impact from the absolute level of GDP per capita, or is it from the trend or direction?
Yeah, I think it's, well, obviously, if the level is absolutely rock bottom, it clearly produces a pretty unhappy result. And you see that in the numbers in Africa, for instance. I mean, they continue to be low and not increasing much. But beyond a certain sort of subsistence level, if you could put it that way, overwhelmingly it's the mathematicians would say it's the first derivative. It's the rate of change. People respond.
Our economy's not been growing and isn't forecast to grow, and people sense that. And is that being reflected, do you think, in these numbers?
I think so. Although the U.S. economy has been growing, and in fact, in relative terms, quite strongly, but their expectations are even stronger. So the rate of growth in all the Western countries has slowed really almost steadily since the 1970s. I mean, there have been ups and downs, obviously, but the overall trend has been down in GDP per capita terms. And I don't think there's any doubt that has had a dampening effect on people's prospects, because we've been conditioned to expect that the greatest thing in life is a continuing material affluence.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about young people.
Yeah.
Dramatic declines in happiness over time in North America, which defy the traditional thinking that happiness peaks when you're young and when you're old and dips in the middle years. Our elder population is happy, the young people not so much. So does this report point us to anything specific that is driving this, or is it just the overall sense among young people that the vibes about the future are bad?
The report, as I said earlier, tends to be pretty much here are the facts.
Right.
They are very guarded in any interpretation. I mean, there's a few paragraphs that suggest that perhaps social media has something to do with it, and I think probably that is a factor. But again, the trend antedates that to a degree, and it's obvious that there are other things going on here. I mean, if you look, young people are going to be more forward-looking. I mean, they will be more concerned about climate change, for instance.
Yeah, which is a huge thing to be hanging over your head.
It is, and the identity revolution, if you can call it that, is something that's affected young people to a much greater degree. The alienation from, I guess, the institutional alienation, the alienation from politics, the alienation from many of the things that my generation valued, took for granted, took comfort from, just don't seem to count much in the lives of certainly the under 30s. And I see a gradient all the way up, looking even at my own children who grew up in pretty politically aware families, and neither one of them, and one is in the early 50s and the other's about to turn 60, they pay very little attention to politics.
Well, hopefully they didn't watch the debate last night. That would not have gotten you interested in politics.
Yeah, my daughter lives in New York, so yeah. So I think there's a general malaise that is playing much more on young people because it affects their life course. They've got 40, 50, 60 years ahead of them, whereas people my age, we're going to skate out.
Right. There's been a lot of talk, though, among some public intellectuals about the impact of social media and maybe COVID on the social support groups and personal interactions that young people have. So does this social support element help explain why young Canadians are less happy? Are they feeling lonely? Are they feeling isolated?
Well, you certainly have lots of anecdotal, and maybe there's more disciplined polling on this that I'm not aware of, but lots of anecdotal evidence that there's an epidemic of loneliness, and of course not only among young people, but among older people too.
Right.
But perhaps it's more acutely felt in the younger generation. I think that's another contributing factor, but really we've sort of got a perfect storm here. Some feeling of isolation, which I think has got a social media component to it. But then again, if you've grown up interacting with a screen, like a fish doesn't notice water, you probably have come to see the natural environment or the arena of social interaction to be screen mediated. I mean, I can tell you, my wife and I go out to restaurants all the time, and we're always among young people. And most of them, there'd be 5 people around a table, and they're just looking at their phones the whole time.
Right.
And sometimes they're showing pictures to one another. And I know that not infrequently they've zoomed in friends from other places. But it's a very alien form of interaction, but it's one that is natural to them. Now,
I wonder if it lends itself to people you would call if you were in trouble, though.
Hard to say. I think you have. Well, I think the answer so far is probably not, because that's showing up in the answers to that question.
Right.
But it's very hard to anticipate, particularly from our vantage point, how culture and social interactions are going to evolve in the presence of a new technology. I mean, there are lots of things in my generation that would have been very alien to my parents, and especially to my grandparents.
Television.
But we adapted. Well, television, absolutely. Any number of things. I mean, cars, the relationship between the sexes, et cetera, et cetera. So humans are pretty adaptable, but I think that social media and the internet and information technology generally are playing havoc with some pretty deep evolutionary traits. I mean, we evolved without social media for a few billion years, and the imprint of that is not easily erased, because I think the information revolution is frankly more profound in psychosocial terms than anything we've seen in hundreds and maybe thousands of years. The only thing you could compare it with, I guess, was Gutenberg and the printing press.
Right. So listeners of a certain age will remember the caboose, that weird red car at the end of the train that everyone recognized, but which remained a mystery. Every kid asked from every back seat, "What's in the caboose?" Railway workers had all sorts of names for it: crummy, doghouse, hayrack, way car, brain box. At CN, our sponsor, the railroaders called it a cab. The caboose was the conductor's office and home. The conductor is responsible for the whole train except the locomotive. The conductor and the brakeman, his assistant, actually used to ride in the caboose, in the cupola, up top. Elsewhere in the caboose were benches, mattresses, a coal bin, a stove, a sink, water, and a fridge. Sadly, the caboose was eventually replaced by a small box of electronics. It works pretty well, but nobody's ever going to write a song about it. Anyway, now you know. A few other random things about CN. The first railway in Canada was built close to 200 years ago, in 1836, between a Montreal suburb and Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu. CN still operates on that short stretch of tracks. At the beginning of the 20th century, the various railroads operating in Canada basically went bankrupt. Under pressure to do something, the federal government consolidated them and formed CN. That was a bit more than 100 years ago. Since then, CN has helped build Canada. It's carried troops in wartime and immigrants to new homes in peacetime. It's hauled untold millions of tons, everything from grain to lumber to minerals. And it's been there to help during emergencies. It has basically moved the Canadian economy on its steel wheels. No wonder Gordon Lightfoot wrote that trilogy anthem. What a theme song. Oh, it's our national holiday in a week or so. The country is another year old. So, in the immortal words of Jean Chrétien, Happy Canada. Okay, so let's talk turkey, though, about policy. Young people are unhappy and old people are happy. Doesn't that reasonably reflect the policy skew in this country and who the society is really serving?
Yes, it does. And you layer on top of that the propensity to vote.
Right.
And sure. And there's no question that that older people have a foreshortened horizon, right? So they're more likely to support redistribution, things like that, because, well, for obvious reasons, I don't have to spell it out. And they're also because of that shortened time horizon, they're much less likely, deep down, to support any of the long-term measures to cope with, let's say, something like climate change. I mean, yeah, I'm certainly going to be long dead and buried before we can really make a difference in the climate. Because no matter what we do now, the momentum that we're going to see for the next 20 years or so is baked in. We could stop emissions tomorrow, and it wouldn't make much difference over the next 15 to 20 years. But for a young person, and particularly even for a young family with children under 10, I mean, they are looking at a future that the difference, if we don't do something about it, is going to be very real.
Right, but at the moment they're preoccupied with other things, and they don't really express that politically in a way that old people express their views about the GIS.
No, exactly. And I've one of the ways I've thought about this in the past is that it largely explains the lagging economy, let's say, in Atlantic Canada, and even to some extent in Quebec, because the demographic skew here is so much to older people that it's very, very hard to get an electorate to approve the kind of longer-term investments that you need to produce a really healthy economy over the next 20, 30, 40 years. There's no switch that you can flip to suddenly make the GDP go up by 10%.
No, but the government tried to have a generational fairness budget, and they said specifically they wanted to make life fairer for young people. And so, they dropped a few billion on housing here and a few billion on other initiatives over there. But if you look at the budget, those young people initiatives were massively dwarfed by the amount of money an aging society is going to spend on old age pensions and healthcare over the next number of years. So despite the rhetoric, the overwhelming weight of federal spending is on old people. Yes,
it is. And when you attack something like the housing crisis, which is critical for young people, the fiscal numbers that the government brings to this problem are completely dwarfed by the scale of the problem.
Right.
I mean, they live on different planets, and unfortunately, people don't look at the ratios and realize how small 3 or 4 billion is relative to the scale of that problem. I mean, it's a pinprick.
Right. So, do you think democracies inherently skew old? like skew toward older people, that they're going to produce a policy because young people don't vote in the numbers that old people vote.
Yeah, that's
like
what
it's
I said
almost
earlier.
2-1. So every person over 65 is worth 2 people electorally under 25. Right?
Yeah, I certainly think that that's true once a level of affluence is achieved for the society as a whole. I think in a society which is still struggling to make it, which I think you're seeing in China today, for instance, a number of the Asian countries, hopefully soon in Africa, there is a strong dynamic to try and raise the economy of the country up to the level of the already affluent countries. And I think in that case, you probably get an across-the-board commitment to the kinds of longer-term investments that will produce that growth. But once you're at the level of affluence of Canada, the U.S., most of the Western European countries, and particularly you combine that with the demographic stagnation of those countries, yes, the politics becomes very, very skewed, and it's one of nature's ways, I guess, of making room for the have-nots to become haves. Other countries will rise to not necessarily to take our place. I think one of the problems that we have is that you don't have to win. You just have to continually maintain a good level. It's a good thing if China catches up to the rest of the world. It's a good thing if India catches up to the rest of the world. We shouldn't see this as a negative. We can gain from that. I mean, we're no longer first then. So we care more about being first sometimes, and speaking more of the Americans.
Everything's relative, Peter.
Yeah.
Everything's relative, right?
But I'm saying perhaps it shouldn't be.
Right. But one of the things I was thinking about China, since you brought it up, is they actually score relatively highly on the freedom quotient, and it's rising.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so that's kind of a counterintuitive result. And I presume that people are saying in China that I have more freedom to make these decisions than I used to have. Maybe because I have more money. So it's more than I used to. One of the things I think about is that's an autocratic society.
Yeah.
How much freedom do you really want people to feel? Like I think back to the Soviet Union, which was solid as a rock as long as people had no freedom. But there's no such thing as a little. You give people some and they go for it.
Yeah, the revolution of rising expectations.
Right.
Yeah, well, and that may turn out to be a problem. I mean, what's interesting, and I'm just looking at the graph here, that on this choice question, China actually has a higher rank than the U.S., and Russia is almost as high as the U.S. Both are a little lower than Canada, quite a bit lower than Finland. But no, I think there are. Maybe unless you're living in China, you don't really know what it's like to live in China. And we
I have no idea. Not one tiny concept of what a day would be like in China.
Right. And when we get a picture of that life that is so filtered through a bunch of ideological lenses that it's really hard to say. And that's why I put quite a bit of store in the data in the World Happiness Report, because it's really based on random samples, simple questions, same wording, and obviously translated properly into many, many different languages. And I think that's a more unfiltered picture of the reality. Right. And it's a bit of a sobering one, I think. But in a way, I think it's good news. It's great that the Chinese are feeling that they've got more freedom of choice.
It is.
I
don't disagree with you.
Yeah.
So hey, if you were back in a policy-making role in Canada, how might this research affect your thinking?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I might dare to suggest, and that is that we really should put a stronger searchlight on these results. That we there is value in in comparison, and it probably would shake a lot of comfortable assumptions. And it would then depend, I guess, on what your political motivation was. If you want to sustain the status quo, you probably want to keep some of this stuff under a very thick blanket. But if you feel that that the country itself has to confront some harder choices over time, then I think the publicity of trends like this is good for the political climate. It'll be challenging. And of course, once you start to put out numbers like this, the ideological tribes will pile on and start pointing out all the methodological flaws, this, that, and that. But I'm not saying that's not a bad debate to have.
Yeah, there's all kinds of methodological challenges to this, but they're on the margin. They're not on the direction of what is being found.
That's
here.
What I believe. And it's because of when you're faced with data that's reasonably credible, and in this case, backed by one of Canada's leading economists, a real Canadian, this is what forces a discussion. People often say, well, we have to have a national discussion about some abstract notion. Well, no, there's no foundation around which to build that discussion.
Right.
These data provide that. So that's one thing. Secondly, I guess I would look at the particular components, and maybe there should be some other factors in the regression analysis, but I would certainly be looking at the two ones that stand out, which is this perception that my freedom of choice is diminished and that social support is not what it once was. And I think you'd have to do a fairly deep dive into what the reasons would be for that. Now, I don't think that should take the form of a royal commission, but there probably has to be some fairly sophisticated analysis done of that. Again, looking across the Western countries particularly, not just Canada and the U.S. So I think until the facts are out there and are generating a discussion, it will be pretty hard to come to base many policy conclusions on a private reading of this. But I think it'd be a terrific way to inspire a debate.
Some things don't fit neatly into these boxes. Like, I presume that people are happier living with physical security, but defense spending doesn't make anybody happy directly.
No. Another one that's not there is there's no specific question on the environment, for instance.
Right.
And that's a huge issue over the last 30 years or so. I think once that would be another virtue of putting the numbers out there in the public eye. You would then get a big debate about what's in and what's out and what should be in, and if it should be in, how would you measure it, etc. I mean, I often make the analogy of life with a game of Scrabble that, there comes a time in the game when all the words are kind of crowded in one part of the board and people are trying to make 2-letter words, etc. And then somebody comes up with an 8-letter word that opens up a huge area of the board, and suddenly the character of the game changes completely. I think we need that kind of a game changer. We need a long word in Scrabble.
Right.
We have to, because we're in too much of a self-referential, staring at our navels kind of culture right now, and political culture particularly. And I think where you're seeing that in its most grotesque form is in the United States. But,
who have the pursuit of happiness in their constitution.
I know. It's
right.
Yeah. And by the way, just a little factoid. Some people might remember that the country of Bhutan, which is up there in the Himalayas, they are often credited with having made the first national commitment to gross national happiness as their North Star.
Right.
And, true enough, they did, and it was much lauded. But I was just reading this morning that in the 2019 World Happiness Report polling, Bhutan was 95th out of 150 countries. So it tells you that
They got some work to do.
Translating these concepts into a political agenda is not an easy thing. Yeah.
Well, surely we can sum it up this way, Peter, which is money. The prosperity of a society is foundational to its population being happy, but that is a necessary but not sufficient condition for happiness. Long
absolutely. Oh, there's no question about that, and that's the wisdom of the ages, and. For a long, for thousands. But
I think we lose sight of the other components. I really do.
Yeah, and I think in a sense, and I'm not speaking as a religious person, but the eclipse of religion has something to do with that. I mean, when that departed as essentially, I'll again call it sort of the North Star that organized the non-material aspects of people's lives. It was more obvious that there was more to life than money, and that's where our ethical principles were rooted. And right now, our ethical principles are only rooted in materialism, and ultimately, that's not enough for the soul. And I think what we're seeing is the implicit recognition of that in these trends in those societies that are farthest down the road to materialism as the only ultimate national goal. That's not enough.
Peter, as always, a fascinating conversation. Thanks for doing this.
Well,
it's such a great time talking with you about this.
I mean, I think I said to you before we came on the show, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an expert in this, but I'm a curious character, and having come upon this report, it's been an eye-opener for me, and I hope for many of your listeners who will delve in not just to my paper, but to the full Monty, as it were.
Well, exactly. But start with the primer. Go over to airquotesmedia.com and read Peter's essentially summary of the document. It's a good way into it, and then go to the report if you want. But there's a lot to think about here, and the generational divide is really worth thinking about. Yeah. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Great for the chat. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS. I'd like to thank our sponsor, CN. Obviously, I'd like to thank Peter Nicholson for sharing his time with us. And thank you, all of you Herle Burly-ites out there who watched or listened to the show. We'll be back next week with more thought-provoking stuff. See you then.
Herle Burly,